On your Friday episode of Locked On Raptors, yes, Bruce Brown still plays for the Toronto Raptors. What is he going to offer the Toronto Raptors this year? There feels like a pretty wide range of outcomes on that.
You are Locked On Raptors, your daily Toronto Raptors podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on? And welcome to another episode of Locked On Raptors, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Friday, September the 6th, and I'm your host, Sean Woodley. I've been covering the Toronto Raptors now for 10, going on 11 seasons on various platforms. You can find all my work over on the really bad website that sucks at Woodley Sean. You can find the show on Instagram at Locked On Raptors. And of course, you can join us in the Locked On Raptors Discord server. Link in the description of the podcast. Come hang out. Someone talk to me about slow horses, please. The books, the shows, both. I just want to talk to somebody in the Discord about slow horses. And of course, you can talk about all the other stuff you want to talk about in there as well. It's a great time. Of course, you can find the show wherever you get your podcast. Follow, subscribe, rate, review. Find the YouTube channel as well. Subscribe over there. Hit the notification bell button. Yada, yada, yada. You know the spiel by now. Do it, okay? And today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app. Create an account. Use the code LOCKEDINNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And let's get rolling here on your Friday edition of the show as we dive into the best case, worst case scenario for Bruce Brown. Yes, continuing our now couple week-long series of shows. We got a couple more left next week to get to as well. But Bruce Brown, interesting guy, maybe someone who a lot of people who like the team didn't want on the team. I certainly had my misgivings with the whole handling of his option and what the Raptors could have done with the flexibility that they would have been afforded by moving on from him. But he's on the basketball team, so we're going to talk about the best and worst case outcomes for Bruce Brown, and we're going to do that with our dear pal, Katie Heindl, the #1 Bruce Brown appreciator, perhaps in the world. Happy to have you here, Katie, for this momentous day. How the hell are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
I just, I know you love Bruce Brown. I know you love the cowboy aesthetic. It just feels like some perfect guest and topic synergy for today. We'll get into the worst case and most likely case outcomes for Bruce Brown as we get deeper into the show, but we should start off positively on a nice note by digging into what we kind of see as the best case outcome for Bruce Brown in what will probably be his last season with the Raptors, ? We'll talk about that whole thing later on as well. But for me, Katie, I think there's a real chance that whatever the best case outcome is for Bruce Brown, we see it this year, because I just do not believe he is the player that we saw down the stretch last season playing in a garbage team context, specifically a garbage team context for a guy who was an additive role player. He was hurt. He was going to be traded, then wasn't traded. And then after he wasn't traded, all the best players on the team got hurt, and it wasn't really a basketball team. I think that if Bruce Brown is in the rotation, which I assume he's going to be, if for no other reason than to build up his trade value ahead of the deadline, we're going to get a better version of Bruce Brown than we saw last season. We can get into what that looks like, but where are you at optimism-wise for a good, nice bounce-back year for Bruce Brown after a rough start to his Raptors tenure last season?
I'm more optimistic than I was last season. And I'll preface this with saying, and the reason, like I told you about this in text of like wanting to come clean about something, is the fact that, yeah, you're right. I love Bruce Brown. He's like the kind of athlete that I would kind of pine for and want to be on Toronto. And yet when we got the news that he was coming to Toronto, I, like a few other people, seemed to immediately talk myself out of why it was a good thing. Namely, like some of the excuses I used. The team wasn't ready for him yet. He didn't fit in the timeline. He's a great athlete, but he deserved better. And I realized I just succumbed. I just thought of these more elaborate ways to succumb to the curse or like brain leech of being a Toronto sports fan, which is thinking you don't deserve things, thinking that things like someone else should have this great thing. Because that's exactly what I was doing. I think also there was the thought that he would get moved pretty quickly, maybe even mid-season. And then when that didn't happen, I was still talking myself out of him. When like No, he plays for the Raptors, damn it. And I want him to play well for the Raptors because I've seen him play well for the other teams. That is why I'm such a huge fan of him. And of course, yeah, his aesthetic, his great and keen fashion sense as well. I was going to say to boot, pun intended.
Hey, I'm gonna put in a drum tap thing after in post. No, I'm not. That's too much work. But it's the thought that counts.
Yeah, people can imagine it. But the only drawback was like maybe the team wasn't ready for Bruce Brown. Maybe that's wait, is that what I said? Yeah, but maybe but
yeah.
You know what I mean? In like the opposite way of what I expected. They were very bad. I could see why that would have been a frustrating season for him. And I think given, all the roster changes and movements and like injuries last season, he was hardly playing by the end of the year. It just seemed like Darko didn't necessarily know where there was a good place to slot this guy that made sense. And I do think that's going to change. We still got to figure a lot of things out with this roster, like, because it's a lot of new and young guys, but it feels more solid. It feels much more solid. And I think that's exactly what someone like Bruce Brown needs. So best case is we just get what we wanted definitely what I wanted last season happens this season.
Totally. And I think there's a blueprint for him to be a valuable contributor on this team in a way that like is meaningful, both to them winning games or looking competent in the first part of the season and potentially then getting moved to the deadline as an expiring guy. Like that's going to be part of the conversation with him all season. It's going to be inescapable. But if he can play himself into a situation where contenders are like, oh, well, we got to add that guy for the final stretch here. Maybe you get a little bidding war going, and maybe that first round pick that it seemed like the Raptors thought they were going to get for him, but never did, it does transpire just after the fact. A lot has to happen because he did not play well last season, right? So there has to be a bit of a bounce back here. But I think the circumstances of the team are also set up to be conducive to that. I think he's probably going to end up being, not Davion Mitchell, not Kelly Olynyk. I think it could be Bruce Brown, just considered as the best bench player on this team. I think he's going to fit into a lot of the different lineups they want to run out there. I think there are times where he might close over Grady Dick just to kind of have a little bit more of like a steadying hand, maybe a little bit more of a defensive look than Grady Dick. Not to say Bruce Brown is like an incredible defender, but he's a good team defender. He knows what he's doing out there. And look, Katie, there is precedent for Bruce Brown fitting in really nicely on a team that is led by a pull-up shooting lead guard and a playmaking hub in the front court. That's what the Raptors have. Do they have prime Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic? No, they don't, but the geometry of things makes sense. And I think there's a world in which Bruce Brown settles into a nice little additive role where he's not being asked to do too much, but he's able to just kind of do the things you want from a winning basketball player. And that then, sort of appeals himself to all kinds of contenders once we get into January, February. Like, am I crazy? Like he's just, I think there's this sort of notion. I don't think you're the only person who talked yourself out of Bruce Brown. I think most of the fan base has talked themselves into Bruce Brown, like being cooked or washed at age 28. And yes, he makes a lot of money for the type of player he is, but everybody knows that. Bruce Brown knows that, and it's only for one more season. I don't think it's like this disastrous thing that his deal is on the books, even if I wouldn't have kept him if I was the Raptors in the summer. I think I would have gone a different route with that roster spot and flexibility. But like, there's a good player in here who we recently have seen be a good player, Katie. Like, I think it's gone way too far in terms of just counting him out and saying, well, he's cooked, he's bad, they're getting nothing for him. That seems so premature and silly for, again, a guy who is 28 years old.
Thankfully, I haven't seen that.
Okay, well, yeah, get out of the comment section. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't read comments, but thank you to the twisted algorithm for once. Yeah, I think that's like an unfair read because what like good team did he have to play with? Like athletes like Bruce Brown and on the way he's sort of established himself, especially in this kind of like, I don't even want to say latter half of his career, because as you pointed out, he's 28 years old. So I think he has more road in front of him. But, certainly his last few seasons with the Nuggets and then post Nuggets, he works very well as someone who can come into an established team that's just missing someone to do a few little intangible things. You pointed out the defensive capabilities. They are there for sure. I think also to just kind of be like a great offensive spark at times. Toronto didn't have any of that last season. It was a jumbly sort of mess. So it makes sense to me why those good things weren't and couldn't really be on display, because there was a real lack of organization. And to the point where, is he supposed to be an organizer because he's technically a veteran on this team? Yes and no. I could see them talking to him about, we want you to do more of that this season. Look, we've got like a more cohesive lineup. We're really not like, we don't have these trades hanging over our heads like we did last season. We have a better blueprint of where we want this team to go. So we want you to be a part of that. I could see them talking to him about that, but also like, he's sort of veteran. He became like veteran by default on this team. So again, if that's any of the criticism of like, well, he's not even contributing as that, like how, I don't think he probably didn't expect to come to Toronto and be asked to do that initially.
Yeah. He's not the kind of player who's going to lift up Malik Williams and Jordan Nwora and Jamias Ramsey. It's just not what he is. He's a guy who was going to play better playing with better players, which he didn't really get a chance to do down the stretch of last season. And hey, even with that, even with the knee injury that he was clearly dealing with that hampered him as well, the numbers are not even that like discouraging from him either. Over the last 16 games of the year, which is a small sample, but it's about half his time with the Raptors. This was after all the injuries befell the Raptors at the start of March. And of course, you have the RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley bereavement absences in there as well. But Bruce Brown, 10 points a game, 3 boards, 3.5 boards, nearly 3.5 assists on 39% from deep, 53% from the field. Like, there's a player in here who can do good things and help a team play more competent basketball. I think we're going to see a better version of him this year. Will he be good enough to warrant that first round pick come deadline time? We'll have to see. That becomes a big question. And there's also the idea of, do they keep him around? If he's really helping the sort of young core of this team round into form, maybe there's a future for Bruce Brown in Toronto beyond this season. We'll examine that coming up later on. I do want to get into, though, the worst case outcome where things don't go well here and it becomes, kind of the same conversation we were having last year about Bruce Brown. We'll get to that coming up in just one sec. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need, the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Back at it here with Katie Heindl. Just a heads up, Locked On NBA as the season draws near is the place to go for your second listen each day. Great show covering all the biggest stories, preview content, wins, over-unders, all that good stuff going into the year with a rotating cast of our Locked On hosts. Go check it out. All right, let's dive in here, Katie, to the worst case scenario for Bruce Brown, which I think basically looks a lot like what we saw last year. Tough fit, hard to find lineups where it really works with him. Maybe the second unit's really struggling. He doesn't really get used in a way that is conducive to him finding success. They don't quite have a role kind of etched out for him, which I think, if you look at the way this team is built, there are ways to use Bruce Brown, I think, in a way that amplify his skills. And it's probably on the coaching staff if they can't find a way to do that, provided health and all the main guys are available. But for you, what does a worst case outcome look like here for Bruce Brown? For me, it's probably they use him poorly. They don't find that role. And you get to the deadline and it's like, well, maybe you get a second rounder for him and you move on. And then it was like all of this for that. Okay, cool. But for you, where are you at as far as the worst case outcome here? And how likely do you think that is to befall Bruce Brown and the Toronto Raptors?
I'm aligned with you. I think where things to look a lot similar to last season, though I kind of land on that as also this team tanking tanking the value of an athlete like Bruce Brown, given that he hasn't necessarily had the runway to showcase himself. And we understand that he let the moves that he's made in the past few seasons, have been to make the most of and strike while the iron's hot in terms of, what kind of contract role players like him can get. And, like people should know this about me. You certainly know this, but yeah, I do fall on the side more of athlete autonomy than necessarily team. The team is looking like as stacked as it can be, for this season. So that's where I think I give myself the leniency to think about what's good for Bruce Brown professionally. But it would be bad for the team in a way too, because I think it would also show, though I kind of go two ways on this, because I don't actually understand if they're trying to attract names for trades at this point where they are. I don't really think they are. But when you tank the value of someone like that, in that it seems like you didn't really have a plan for them, you do it for one season where things are a little bit messy. It can kind of be understood just given the landscape of the Toronto Raptors last season, but you do it a second season, and that can reflect pretty poorly on a team, especially under new coaching staff and trying to, ostensibly find a new direction. So I would say if they are trying to attract other role players, or maybe a big, or maybe, to bring in another athlete, and to say, like, we understand how to work. Just because you haven't been here forever doesn't mean we don't know how to work with you. Like, to not be able to do that, I think could be a pretty bad deficit for the team itself. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the capability side, it's like to squander even, a few. I don't think he's washed, but if that is like the general consensus, you still have good minutes that you could be putting this guy into play for you. You know what I mean? Like, he's a competent, capable player that is probably able to slow things down in a way that a young team could use this season. So to be able to use him almost as maybe a pressure release valve. And if they don't really do that and things are just going like breakneck speed, I feel like that's a worst case. That's a more specific, like, worst case scenario.
Yeah. Like, there's totally a world in which they just like don't understand how to use Bruce Brown. And look, he's a difficult guy to sort of find that exact role for, right? He's got kind of an interesting skill set, and he's had all kinds of stops throughout his career of varying degrees of success, playing with very good, very not so good teams. Like, there's not like there's not a total blueprint on the exact way to use Bruce Brown. I think a lot of it is dependent on the skill sets of the other guys he's playing with. But like I said, like, they have the infrastructure, I think, and they have a little bit more shooting on hand than they had in years past. I think there is an avenue here to just sort of find him a couple of niches within the team that he can fill very capably. And if they can't, to your point, like, that speaks pretty poorly of the people putting things into practice on the court. Not to mention, if it does go poorly here, they can't rehab his value and turn him into, if their intention is to trade him and they can't sort of trade him for whatever it seemed like they thought they could get for him when they got him in the Pascal Siakam trade, that just speaks, it's like another mark on their recent track record of being really bad at reading the market, right? Yeah. Like, they misread it with Fred VanVleet. They misread it with Pascal Siakam. Like, they've done this. They've overpaid for role players that maybe they didn't have to. Like, it's been a bit of a rough go here, and I'm willing to give the sort of opportunity to clean the slate and kind of learn from past mistakes and get better for a front office that has won an NBA championship in the last 5 years. But if this is another situation of just totally misgauging and having a little bit of sort of market hubris about what they can get, that it starts to pile up, and it starts to, demand a whole lot of questions be answered. As far as like the ways in which the team shape sort of excludes Bruce Brown, I think there's a couple things that could happen here, right? There's like not using him in the ways where he's effective. I think there's a real chance. I talked about Davion Mitchell earlier this week and why I think he's more of an off-ball player than a lead guard. Like, I think giving Bruce Brown some legitimate run as the backup point guard, just to kind of, like you said, sort of bring some control and steadiness to the mix, I think that's a way to optimize him. And I think, because he's not a shooter, putting the ball in his hands a little bit more, it's probably a pretty effective way to kind of mitigate that a little bit if they're shooting around him. If they're not using him in that way, I think that could hurt him. And I also think there's just a lot of competition at the 2-guard spot for the Raptors, as we've talked about, there's roughly 14 2-guards on this roster. And, maybe someone like Jacoby Walter with a little bit more sort of natural shooting talent becomes someone they look at. Maybe Davion Mitchell becomes the 2 and they go somewhere else with the backup point guard job and Bruce Brown struggles there. And, maybe Jamal Shedd's getting run over Bruce Brown. If that's the case and Bruce Brown's just getting buried in the rotation, that's going to hurt things as well when it comes to, deadline time and you're trying to make something happen there. There's definitely ways they can screw this up, Katie, I guess is what I'm saying.
I like the idea of having him as a point guard. I think that makes a lot of sense for the reasons that we talked about. And I think to have him be able to showcase some of his talent there and more decision making, things like that. I like that. That seems like a very tidy fix. You should get them on the phone, Sean.
I mean, he's not like your traditional,
yes,
he's not your Tyus Jones, right? Like he's not that type of guard, but I don't think they necessarily need a guy like that because they do have a lot of other supplementary playmaking from other spots. So if you can have someone who can bring the ball up and just get them into their stuff, that feels like a pretty good way to use Bruce Brown to me. And then also we've seen a lot of Bruce Brown being successful as that sort of prototypical, maybe kind of the first prototype of the small guy who does big man things, right? And I think in the very first game they played last year, him and Scotty Barnes ran like 2 or 3 pick and rolls, and it was just short roll pass to Bruce Brown, floater from the middle, short roll pass to Bruce Brown, pass to a baseline cutter. Like there's a short roll element to his game that I think they could really make use of as well, especially in lineups where maybe it's Scotty or Quickly kind of running the show, but you've got Kelly Olynyk out there spacing to the corners, and you have the middle of the floor where Bruce Brown can kind of run amok as the short roll guy. Like I think that's a way to use him and sort of optimize his skills as well, which they just did not nearly do enough last season. I think that's the thing that he's always been good at, and they need to find a way to make that more part of his repertoire too. We're going to come back, Katie, get back on the other side here and get into what our most likely outcome is for Bruce Brown, what we kind of actually think is going to happen here, and get into the idea of, okay, if things go really well this season, do they just keep Bruce Brown around? We'll get into that coming up in just 1 sec. Today's show is brought to you by BetterHelp. Ben, look, at this time of year, it's busy. You've got all kinds of things on the go. Your kids are going back to school. They're continuing to learn. And as adults, sometimes we forget how to prioritize doing that for ourselves. But sometimes it's important to kind of get back in touch with the things that you want to be doing, the things you want to learn. Maybe you want to learn a new skill. Maybe it's gardening. Maybe you want to learn a new language. Whatever it might be, therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder because your back to school era can come at any age. It's difficult to prioritize the things you want to do for yourself when there's a million other things going on and the world is throwing at you. If you're thinking of starting therapy, though, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. That's a big deal. Sometimes it's not a right fit right away, but you can change it up and find that person who's going to connect with you and help you talk through the things in your life. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Back at it here with Katie Heindl. Another plug across the network for everyone to go check out. Go look at yesterday's episode of Locked On Celtics, where John Corrales had Joe Mazzulla on the podcast. And boy, oh boy, does that guy have some quotes. Holy, go listen to John and Joe Mazzulla. Wild times. All right, Katie, let's dive on into the most likely outcome for one Bruce Brown this coming season. How do you think this all plays out? Do you think the Raptors go and get what they kind of, again, envisioned themselves getting in return for him at the deadline from a contender? Do they find a way to use him within the team? Is it like a sort of, if we're going on the spectrum of worst case to best case, where does he kind of slot in and tilted towards for you?
I think some of the reticence around trading sticks around. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I feel like that is baked into the DNA of the team at this point in time. Mm-hmm. The most likely to me feels like a mix of what we've said. So trying him out in different positions and seeing where he works as a great pressure release valve. I can also unfortunately see them still backburnering him a little bit because they're opting And to be fair, they want to opt for this, but development and run for their younger players that they're going to invest in. Because if this is a young team that's building around Scotty Barnes, that is what they have to do. They look at Bruce Brown as not someone that's necessarily going to be there for the long haul, right? Or for this long of a runways it's going to take to build that Scotty Barnes team up. So I could still see him getting, kind of shifted around at the behest of other guys, which is unfortunate. But I think that is also the situation they've put themselves in. So I'd love to see flashes. So best case, I feel like I don't know if he's even playing. Not best case, most likely case. I don't know if he's even playing every game. We're seeing him maybe come off the bench for like 6 to 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Sometimes that feels likely to me. Maybe mid to late game.
Right. So I think he's going to be part of the rotation for the first however many months of the season before trade season kicks in. I think like
I like it.
Like,
am I just doing what I said I would stop doing?
I think you are, Katie. You're talking yourself out of Bruce again. Unbelievable.
It's crazy.
You got to just lock yourself in a room, put on a cowboy hat and some boots, and think about what you've done. Okay. But I think, like they're invested one way or another in Bruce Brown being in the rotation to start the season. I don't think they're going to go and play all their rookies right away. That's a lot. 3 of them are second-round picks, one of whom is Ulrich Shamshay, who I don't think is going to look at the NBA this season. Like Jamal Shedd's going to start in the 905. Jonathan Mobo doesn't really play the same position. You're basically talking about, of the young players, Ochai Agbaji, I guess, as sort of a positional combatant for that 2-guard spot, even though I think there's a real chance Ochai might have lost himself a job with his summer league performance. If you can do that, it was like kind of impressively poor, which sucks. And, you hope you can turn it around, but I don't think that's leaving many people feeling super optimistic about Ochai coming into the year. And there's Jacoby Walter, who might fight for minutes at that spot as well. Of course, you can play Bruce Brown in all kinds of different places. He's a jack of all trades type. And so I still think they'll find ways for him to play. I think he's going to be part of the top 8 of the rotation, along with Kelly Olynyk and Davion Mitchell. And I do think he can still be helpful to the development here. Like, I think we look at the development thing of, all the rookies, but I think the most important development story for the Raptors this year is quickly Barnes, Grady Dick, RJ Barrett. Like, those are the guys that actually matter the most right now. Yes. And I think Bruce can be helpful for moving those guys along to whatever the next phase of their development is going to be. So I think there's an investment in him playing up front, even if it is just to build up his trade value to move him by February. And I think that's ultimately what happens, right? I think maybe he doesn't get traded for a first. Maybe it's like a late first or like a fake first or something like that. Maybe it's a couple seconds or like a second and a second draft type player like they sort of pursued with Ochai last year. But I think he gets traded for something that will probably leave people feeling pretty mid about the return, but it's not nothing. And they can kind of move on, and there's like something else in the coffers for them to work with in the future. Of course, Katie, there is an outcome here where he plays really well. The team maybe surprises a bit, and he looks like a guy who can be an additive fixture alongside their young, important upcoming players. And he hits free agency this summer. The Raptors have his bird rights, and they say, hey, Bruce, want to stick around for a couple more years on a lesser salary than the 22, 23 he's making right now? Again, I think even if you ask Bruce Brown, he would say, yeah, I'm probably making more money than I'm kind of worth in the open market. Maybe there's a sort of resettling around the mid-level exception number or even less than that. And Bruce Brown is a Raptor for multiple years beyond this one. What level of likelihood would you give that outcome taking place here, Katie? It feels like a pretty low-end one, but I don't think it's off the table.
Well, given the idea that you floated, which I do like, of him as a conduit almost from the quite green young team that has to develop, and the team that's going to be the focus, the lineup rather, that's going to be the focus of this season, that does feel like a good fit, another kind of tidy fit. That's your 2 for 2 on those, Sean. It's great. I think it's not like he'll play so well that then his trade value is going to skyrocket. I think he'll play well because he is a smart athlete who also understands he needs to showcase something he didn't get an opportunity to last season. But I think he might just naturally expire in that conduit. You know what I mean? Because if that starting roster looks solid by mid-season, say, and you've got these developmental guys on their way, then at some point you've got to put the two together, which negates the need for that conduit piece.
100%.
So it might be a good thing in that the team and him both kind of, now I'm so skeptical if I'm like gaslighting myself, but if like the team and him grow out of each other in a way that's like he gets to actually play and do all the things he wanted to do last season, showcase his talent, that he's still useful for a team, a developing team, of which there are many right now around the NBA, and like good developing teams, like teams on the verge, you know what I mean? Where he could end up. If he doesn't, that's great. And I'll say right now, I'll be happy to have Bruce Brown, a Raptor. I got to get over this. I think I just don't have a sample size of play to work with, right?
Yeah.
As a Raptor, maybe that's where some of my own reticence comes from.
It has been so long since we saw this team play a real basketball game, Katie. I can't even fathom it right now. It's nuts.
I have to get over this. I have to not do this tragic thing, this woe is us thing. I don't feel that way. Don't want to bring Bruce Brown into that.
I'm glad you've come around here, Katie. But I think really well taken point on the sort of idea that he can help shepherd this team along for a few months. And then if he is traded at the deadline for whatever they trade him for at the deadline, that opens up the space for a Jacoby Walter or a Jamal Shed or whomever to kind of fill in those back end rotation minutes down the stretch, when by that time, maybe the Raptors are not so worried about racking up wins. And it's more of a, hey, let's see what we got here type of thing as they gain the lottery system going into the offseason. Look, it's gross. I hate it, but it's probably a reality of what we can expect this season, as much as it's lame loser stuff. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to leave things off here with Bruce Brown. I'm excited to watch him play basketball in a context that does not require him to be literally the best player on the floor. I think it's going to be a sort of, not to the level that I was predicting a Jakob Poeltl renaissance earlier this week with Big V. But I do think there will be something of a bounce back for the reputation and belief that Bruce Brown is in fact not cooked as an NBA role player. Katie, anything you want to promote for the good people out there before we wrap things up?
No. Basketball feelings. You can read that.
Yeah, do that. Basketball feelings. Subscribe, pay for it. I pay for it. It's lovely. Of course, you can find me over on the bad website at Woodley Sean. Find the show on Instagram. Find us on Discord, of course. Link in the description of the podcast. Free to join. As always, it's much appreciated when you support the show. However it is you just choose to support the show. We'll be back again next week. We've got a couple more guys to cover off. We've got Kelly Olynyk, and of course, we've got the big one, Scotty Barnes, as we continue best case, worst case to round out the pre-return schedule to 5 days a week, which will be coming as of September the 16th. So, looking forward to that, as well as Media Day will be here before we know it. Preseason games in less than a month. It's all happening, Katie. What also is happening is the end of the podcast. We'll talk to you again next week. Thanks for hanging. Bye-bye. I used the bouncy ball this time and nearly broke my computer.